No one thought a 27-year-old would shut down one of the most powerful women in American politics. And yet that's what was done on live TV in front of millions of people to Karoline Leavitt. A young conservative upstart entered the Capitol hearing room knowing she'd be outed, outmanned, and misunderstood. But what followed turned the whole room on its head. Pelosi arrived armed with pointed questions, sure that she could trap Leavitt and undermine the economic legacy of the Trump administration. But Karoline never blinked. Rather, she presented a subdued confidence that no one expected, particularly Pelosi. The stunt that started out as a political ambush rapidly became a generational battle of facts against framing. This was not a debate, it was a public reckoning. And the actual twist, the biggest shock, didn't happen until the last part, when Leavitt revealed something that even Pelosi's own party couldn't anticipate. So make sure you watch until the end, because what Karoline speaks towards the end alters everything. The chamber was filled with low murmurs as Karoline Leavitt sat down. She glanced around the committee room lined with cameras, aides, and congressional heavyweights. Her posture was straight, her expression calm. On the far side of the table sat Nancy Pelosi, flanked by Democratic representatives who were already flipping through their talking points. A staffer leaned toward Pelosi, whispered something, and then the goal hit. The hearing began. "Let's start with economic transparency," Pelosi declared, shooting a fleeting glance in Leavitt's direction. "We've heard a great deal of noise from this administration. Jobs created, inflation, controlled wages growing. But when you strip away the numbers, the truth looks a great deal less impressive." Karoline didn't flinch. She had been waiting for this very opening. Pelosi went on. "You say inflation's declining, yet consumer prices keep rising. Job statistics look great in black and white, yet we both know those are gig economy and part-time fillers." Karoline fiddled with her mic. "Congresswoman," she started even and firm, "you're correct that statistics can be deceptive when you cherry-pick them." A few eyebrows raised in the room. Pelosi's smile remained, but narrowed. Karoline extracted a folder. "This is the complete BLS report for the last quarter. You quoted job growth from Section 3, but omitted Section 5, where it states more than 72% were full-time hires. And when you look at core inflation, energy and food adjusted, the rate fell from 4.8% to 3.6%, 6%, a 25% decrease." The room fell silent. Pelosi interrupted. "That's not the whole story, but it's the part you didn't say." Karoline shot back, still calm. "Facts are not partisan, even when they're uncomfortable." A buzz ran through the room. Reporters started typing. Pelosi sat back, furrowing her brows. "Is that your argument, that we've conquered inflation?" she pressed. "No," replied Karoline. "I am arguing that the data is showing us progress, genuine progress. And if we're here to discuss transparency, then let's at least begin by telling the whole story, and not just the half that serves a headline." Behind her, some staffers exchanged glances. One Democratic aide stopped typing. For the first time during the hearing, it was Pelosi who paused, and in the moment of silence that followed, Karoline's voice had already commandeered the room. Pelosi's silence was short-lived. She leaned forward once more, obviously not about to let a 20-something press secretary get the upper hand. "I admire zeal," she stated, her tone measured, but slicing. "But zeal is no replacement for experience. The American public is sick of cherry-picked victories. They are hungry for real answers, not scripted sound bites." Karoline didn't budge. "That's precisely why I'm here." The room again stiffened. She opened her second folder, sliding a printout across the table to the panel. "These are the Department of Commerce quarterly growth numbers. You'll notice that during this regime, GDP increased at 2.8% in the last quarter. That's not an exaggeration. It's from your own quoted source. The Congressional Budget Office estimate indicated we'd come to a halt at 1.5%, but we did better than that. Why hasn't that been included in your story?" And Toya, Pelosi didn't grab the paper. One of her members, Representative Doyle, did. Karoline went on. "I'm not here to defend a story. I'm here to highlight what's being left out and why the American people are entitled to the whole picture, not outrage filtered." Doyle turned the page deliberately. "The figures were actual," Pelosi persisted. "You spoke of core inflation, but Americans don't live on core inflation. They purchase gasoline, food, rent apartment. Karoline nodded. Yes, and those figures were savage last year. But, come on, supply chains didn't fix themselves overnight. This administration enacted bipartisan legislation to tackle those exact problems. You voted down that bill. Pelosi raised an eyebrow. Karoline pushed forward, and still gas prices dropped 17% this year. Rent inflation has eased for 6 months in a row. That's not a press release. It's a trend. There was no applause, only silence. Not because others disagreed, but because nobody anticipated it. Pelosi folded her arm. So you're taking the stance that the economy is strong. Karoline inhaled. My stance is that it's stronger than you are reporting to people. And your stance, your framing isn't serving those that need to know. It's confusing them for partisan politics. Pelosi's lips opened as if she were about to say something, but nothing exited. A CNN reporter in the rear stood up to take a picture. That's when a voice cut in from the other end of the room. I'd like to say something, said Representative Harris, a moderate Democrat who never spoke at these hearings. All heads turned. I'm looking at this data, and I'm not saying I agree with everything the Trump team did, but these numbers don't lie. If what Ms. Leavitt is telling us is true, then why didn't they bring any of this up during last week's economic press briefing? It was tactful, but Pelosi stiffened. Karoline didn't respond. She didn't have to. Representative Harris was already glancing on his own side of the aisle, and the fissures were starting to appear. Pelosi readjusted her blazer and nodded curtly. Let's move on, she said. But everyone knew that they weren't letting up because in one round, Karoline had performed something that not many had done before. She made Nancy Pelosi blink. The atmosphere in the room had changed. What began as a platform for Pelosi to flex her muscle had become a war of facts. Reporters were now murmuring behind open laptops, and even committee members looked ruffled. Karoline wasn't supposed to arrive with this sort of calm, much less data that undermined the Democratic narrative. But it wasn't over yet. A new voice joined in. Miss Leo, since you're so confident in your figure, tell me, how do you account for the millions of Americans who are still struggling with housing affordability? It was Representative Delgado, one of Pelosi's strongest allies. He addressed the practiced tone of a man who thought he had just caught her off guard. Karoline focused on him. That's a good question. Housing affordability is a problem, but we have to be specific about why it's occurring. She tapped the folder once more. There was a national slowdown in construction in 2020 and 2021. Permits declined. Labor shortages increased. That wasn't a Republican or Democrat problem. It was a national crisis. But under this administration, housing starts have rebounded nearly 14% in the last year. The market isn't fixed, but it's recovering. Delgado opened his mouth but didn't speak. She continued, and while we're discussing affordability, why hasn't anyone here raised the fact that median salaries increased 4.3% in the same time frame? Not record high, but sufficiently to beat inflation for the first time in years. That really hit home. Representative Doyle, still scanning through the hand, nodded slightly. Pelosi interrupted with a voice harder now. You're discounting the hurt that people experience in the supermarket. You're coating it over with percentages. Karoline stood her ground. No, I'm demonstrating that we have improved. Human beings still hurt. Yes, but to report to them that nothing has gotten better is deceptive. It undermines trust, particularly when it is politically expedient to pretend the sky is falling. A hum coursed through the room once more. It wasn't Republicans this time just muttering among themselves. Pelosi rocked back in her chair, then gestured to the next speaker, but Karoline stood firm. Before we proceed, she added, I'd like to make one final point. Pelosi paused but did not protest. Karoline held up a single-page chart. This, she said, is the unedited version of the economic snapshot used in your press release last week. Your office clipped out the part showing real wage growth. You left in only the part where consumer confidence dipped. She paused, allowing the silence to fill the room. That was not a mistake. That was a decision. Cameras rolled in. One aide in the rear walked out with a phone to his ear. Pelosi remained seated, her face a mask. Karoline went on. If this hearing is about transparency, then let's actually be transparent. It wasn't a speech, it was a challenge. And no one, not even Pelosi, reacted. Outside the hearing room, social media was already on fire. Videos of Karoline's serene deconstruction of the talking points were being posted by the second. Hashtags with her name were trending within the hearing pushed on. But something had changed for good. Karoline Leavitt was no longer defending a platform. She was changing the conversation. The hearing plodded on, but the vibe had shifted. Karoline had pierced the narrative with precision, and even those who arrived prepared to brush her aside were now hearing more intently. Representative Green, another Democrat, attempted to wrestle control back. Let us not forget that we are hearing from someone today who is the representative of a president who departed from this country with record deficits in a splintered country. If we are going to speak about facts, let us speak about where this administration began. Karoline smiled and turned a page in her binder. That's precisely what I'm referring to. Context, you've just provided some, but not the whole of it. Want to discuss the deficit? Of course, in 2020, emergency expenditures blew out the number. But do you have any idea what then occurred? She gazed up. We reduced the deficit by more than $1.3 trillion the very next budget year. That is the largest single-year decline in U.S. history. A couple of the committee members ceased scrolling on their phone. Green folded her arms. You're making it sound like it was all perfect. No, Karoline said. I'm saying there's a distinction between admitting problems and acting like nothing got better just because it wasn't under your party. Her voice didn't increase. It didn't have to. Representative Harris leaned forward once more. I have to say, I've been here years. This is the first time I've had anybody your age come into this room and present a better argument than the total of the people who are running it. The praise wasn't backhanded, and it was not ignored. Pelosi shifted a little in her chair. Karoline nodded in response, but remained on message. This isn't about me. This is concerning the way that the truth is being filtered. Americans are fed up with being told what to think. They want access to the whole picture, not the pieces of information that serve a party line. That line came crashing down. One journalist mouthed, "Wow," under her breath. The cameraman leaned in. Pelosi cleared her throat. So, what's your suggestion then? We allow press secretaries to rephrase our economic policy. Karoline smiled weakly. No, ma'am, I'm suggesting that when you show the American people data, you don't leave it in a drawer. For the first time, a light guffaw spread through the room. Even Pelosi had to tighten her lips, but still. But Karoline wasn't finished. She leaned forward, her voice a bit softer now. This isn't about you. You've had a long career. You've done things I might never see eye to eye on, but I respect your spot in this room. She stopped, then said, but we're in a different moment now. Americans aren't looking for leaders, they're looking for truth-tellers, and they'll take them wherever they can get them. It was low-key, but it hit hard. Pelosi remained stoic, but her silence spoke volumes. As the hearing progressed to its next phase, Karoline leaned back in her chair. She wasn't defending herself anymore. She was setting the agenda. The interlude between phases offered no respite. Reporters clogged the corridor. Hush-hush, commentators murmuring at what they just saw. A few actually junked their already mapped-out cut-ins, trading headlines on the spot. At the chamber floor, Pelosi's group also huddled instantly, whispering to each other across the conference table and skimming through papers with subdued determination. Karoline remained motionless. She just knew they would come stronger second round. The next round went to Representative Foster, a grizzled old Democrat known to specialize in digging into data. Miss Leavitt, he replied, you've come here quoting numbers and growth charts, but how do you answer the Federal Reserve's own report that household debt is increasing once again? Wages may be increasing, but so are credit card balances. That's not sustainable. Karoline bent forward. That is true. Debt is increasing, but it isn't the whole picture. Debt-to-income ratios remain below pre-pandemic levels. What that means is that individuals are spending more, yes, but not in an irresponsible manner. They're purchasing delayed purchases, travel maintenance, school tuition. That's a rebound, not a collapse. Foster scowled slightly. Karoline went on. You're also omitting saving. Household saving rates surged following stimulus initiative, and although they have decreased, the average savings account remains above where it stood 5 years ago. She let that penetrate. It's disorganized, she said, but it's not coming apart, and lying about it won't serve anyone. Representative Foster turned over a page, but did not pursue. He was fishing for another line of attack. Pelosi interrupted instead. Are you saying Americans are okay with paying more, that they should just get used to it? Karoline responded swiftly. No, I'm telling them they deserve leaders who speak the truth to them, that inflation exists, that recovery isn't even, but that progress is occurring. That's not spin, that's respect. The room fell silent once more. Representative Lawson, a younger Democrat, raised his hand slightly. You keep mentioning transparency, but you're employed by the Trump campaign. Transparency wasn't really their thing. Why would we ever take this version of events? Karoline didn't flinch. Because I'm not requesting that you trust me. I'm requesting that you read the numbers for yourself. I brought all my sources, all my citations. You can fact-check every word. She stared straight at him. You don't have to trust me. Just read. He looked away. His hand fell. For the first time, the committee was not interrogating Karoline. They were questioning themselves. Pelosi attempted again. It is simple to come in with shiny numbers, but you don't have to run from voters like we do. You don't have to respond when a mother says why eggs are $5. Karoline gazed at her calmly. But I do respond every day I address the press. I answer questions. I have critics. And I don't tailor answers to fit a side. Her tone edged just a bit tougher. The difference is that I'm not blaming the data if it doesn't fit my message. Now tension was tangible. Some Democrats leaned back. Nobody cut her off anymore. Not because they agreed, but because they knew she came armed with something beyond a talking point. She arrived with receipts, and with every receipt, the room moved in her direction. Outside the hearing room, videos of Karoline's answers were already being posted on social media. The biggest surprise was not even her performance. It was how easily she dismantled a storyline that had remained largely unchallenged. Inside again, the pressure was building. Pelosi's next step was not a question, it was a strategy. She motioned to Representative Castillo, who changed the subject. Let's move away from numbers for a second, Castillo said. You represent an administration marked by division. How are you going to get anyone to take this message seriously when the rhetoric from your camp is so over the top? Karoline didn't wait. That's a reasonable question. But let me ask you, when did you last judge a policy on outcome rather than tone? That took him aback. She went on. We can argue tone ad infinitum, but families are not browsing Twitter. They're browsing prices. They need solution, not slogan. Castillo attempted to cut her off, but Karoline plowed on. You speak of division, but was not your own party's press secretary, the one who labeled half of the country a threat to democracy? If you desire unity, you don't achieve it by demonizing the other side. You achieve it by meeting facts head-on. Even Republicans sat up and took notice. That was not merely a comeback. That was a reframing. Pelosi leaned forward. So tone doesn't count whatsoever. No, Karoline responded. I'm not saying it's not important more than outcomes are. Another subdued ripple went through the room. Representative Harris spoke again. I'll admit, I didn't anticipate this, but I've listened intently, and I've never heard one stat she couldn't substantiate. He glanced over at Pelosi's side of the table, and if we're honest, a great deal of the frustration here isn't with accuracy, it's about who is communicating the message. Who is communicating the message. It was courageous, perhaps too courageous for some of his own, but he did not retract it. Karoline nodded subtly in his direction before turning back to the panel. There is a reason that the public no longer trusts DC, she said, because every time they hear something good, they're informed it's a lie, and every time they hear something bad, it's exaggerated as the apocalypse. She leaned forward once more. They're exhausted, and if you're going to reach them, you need to begin telling the truth, particularly when it works against you. Pelosi said nothing. Neither did the rest of her team. This was the first time since the hearing started that they didn't have a follow-up. Karoline looked at her notes, but didn't turn another page. She didn't have to, because by this time, she wasn't the one running with the story. She was the news. By afternoon, the headlines wrote themselves. Leavitt turns the tables. Pelosi outflanked by 27-year-old conservative. The clip Democrats didn't want going viral. But within the hearing, There was one more round to go. Pelosi stayed quiet, while her aide handed her a folder. Then, only one page of final attempt. She spoke in a colder tone. Now, Miss Leavitt, you've spoken about economic recovery, job creation and energy prices. But what about inequality? Income disparities keep expanding. Doesn't that invalidate all the things you've asserted today? Karoline hesitated. Inequality exists, and neither party has got rid of it. But we ought to at least be honest about its causes. She rose from her seat, not theatrically, but intentionally, and held up a plain chart. This is according to the U.S. Census Bureau. It indicates that whereas the top 1% have increased their portion, so has the bottom 50%. That's a post-pandemic trend of recovery. You can verify for yourself. Pelosi remained mum. Karoline didn't blink. You can't combat inequality if you don't know where it's getting better. But when betterment is disregarded because it happened under a political rival, you don't serve people, you confuse them. Pelosi leaned back, once again crossing her arms. Karoline continued, and if we are going to discuss helping the working class, let's discuss the manufacturing boom. More than 800,000 jobs added in the past 2 years. That didn't just happen by accident. It happened because of deregulation, tax incentives, and trade leverage, none of which your party voted for. There was silence again. Representative Green gazed down at the table. Representative Foster moved in his seat. Even Castillo remained silent. Karoline went to the table, set the chart down face up, and sat back. This is larger than me, larger than party victory. Americans are intelligent. They know what's occurring, but they're exhausted from the din. She looked over at the press cameras. I don't expect to be in line with everyone, but if we're going to lead, we owe them honesty. And at this moment, what they're receiving is spin. A few cameras snapped in the distance. One of the committee members, an independent, spoke up softly. She's not wrong. Pelosi tapped her pen softly, but didn't utter a word, because there wasn't anything else to say. Karoline glanced back over the table, and for the first time all day, each individual in the room was listening, not to dispute, but to hear. The last portion of the hearing was less about a confrontation and more like an reckoning. What began as an attempt to discredit a young representative had turned into something altogether different. Karoline was not merely standing her ground, she was defining it differently. Even journalists ceased to build their narratives around Pelosi. They were interested in the woman who had not blinked even once. Representative Doyle interrupted again. Miss Leavitt, you've made your point, but don't you think your ascension indicates a greater issue? That politics is increasingly about media moments rather than policy? Karoline nodded. I do, and I believe that's why today is significant. She looked at the cameras, and then at Doyle. You're correct. Too many people pursue viral video rather than actual solution. But if I can put actual data in front of the American people through this platform, even for 5 minutes, then that's 5 minutes more understanding than they were receiving previously. He didn't oppose that. He just looked away. Pelosi breathed. Come on, Miss Leavitt. You've been trained to spin to win headlines, to get people to feel something, whether it's indignation or pride. But governing is different. Karoline's voice remained steady. And I'm not here to govern. I'm here to report. She allowed the room to have that silence for a moment. Leadership comes later, but it has to begin with telling the truth. And currently, the truth is being buried under political strategy. The credit buried under political strategy. That's not governance either. Pelosi folded her hand, her face unreadable. Karoline went on. This hearing had been convened to look at economic messaging. But maybe the real question isn't about the numbers. Maybe it's about why some people are so afraid of the full picture. That hit the air like a pin dropped in a cathedral across the aisle. Retiers leaned in toward his mic. I believe the American people are more able than we credit them with regarding nuance, and what I've heard today. It was not spin, it was research, and it was presented in more clarity than I've ever witnessed. He was not interrupted by anyone, not even Pelosi. Karoline nodded once, neither smiling nor gloating, merely showing acknowledgement of the change. And for the first time in hours, she seemed fatigued. Not under stress, but from staying firm this long. Pelosi scanned the clock. We'll recess in 5 minutes, she announced. But in reality, the hearing had wrapped up much earlier. When the gobble finally descended, a silent scuffle permeated the room. The press scrambled to get out their stories. Aides whispered in ears and legislators scrambled for the exit, some shying away from eye contact altogether. Karoline did not get up. She understood what had just occurred. Pelosi remained steadfast, though stiff. Her staff closed in, one muttering something hastily into her ear. She didn't react. Her gaze drifted once again in Karoline's direction, this time without the measured disdain she bore earlier. Outside in the hall was loaded microphone, blinding lights, dozens of voices. But Karoline didn't pause for the cameras. She went slowly, deliberately, with only her binder clutched in her hand. The same binder she came in with, the same one they believed would not count. A reporter cut through the throng. "Karoline, what do you have to say to critics who say this was all show?" She hesitated. "If it was theater," she said, "then I suppose they didn't anticipate the facts to hijack the play." The audience responded immediately. Flashing cameras, audio recorders raised higher. One additional question. Did today damage Pelosi's credibility? Karoline didn't bite. "I think people saw something authentic today. They can judge for themselves." She pressed on. Inside, members of the committee remained behind closed doors. Harris, still clutching the notes he'd written as she testified, moved past two Democrats and said, "We should have been the ones voicing those things." They didn't argue. Pelosi went into her private office, closing the door behind her. She remained quiet as sounds outside reached a crescendo. Her phone vibrated. Dozens of texts. One from a top party strategist wrote, "That girl just destroyed the whole message plan." Pelosi gazed at the screen. She had misjudged her utterly. Karoline did not arrive with attitude, volume, or belligerent. She arrived with evidence, and even her opponents could not deny that her voice had pierced the din. Think tanks, talk shows, and Washington political advisors scurried to react throughout Washington. A segment of Karoline citing actual wage growth quietly had reached 1 million. By the end of the hour, it would be triple. And by dawn, it would be one of the most hotly discussed political debates of the year. Not because of drama, but because it made the silence deafening than the argument. The headlines were unrelenting the following day. Late's calm crushes Pell's rhetoric. A new star on the right. Even Democrats acknowledged she had the facts. Morning shows nationwide rebroadcast segments of the hearing. Hosts who generally dismissed Trump supporters adopted a different tone. Not because they went along, but because they could not deny what they witnessed. She did not yell. She did not deflect. She did not stumble. Karoline Leavitt simply responded with facts, with authority, and with a veracity that had even veteran politicians stuttering. Political observers registered the change. It was called nuclear by one Democrat. "We've heard a lot of viral moments in Congress, but this wasn't a moment, it was a message," he said. Another respondent added, "If this is the future of conservative messaging, Democrats are going to have to get new playbooks." At the Capitol, aides for both parties were still discussing. Some were annoyed, others amazed. Some quietly wondered how a 27-year-old was able to get something done that their own party couldn't get done for years, making complex policy simple and authentic. Representative Harris, who didn't often do interviews, made a quick statement to the media. She didn't travel here to showboat. He said she came ready to do work, and she made that room take notice. Karoline, meanwhile, said nothing. No victory lap, no press tour. She went back to her office, organized her notes, and called her mother. "It went well," she said, and no more. Later that night, she scrolled through her phone. Oh! A half-dozen texts, 100 mentioned, but one stood out. It was from a prominent economist who had previously criticized the Trump administration. His note said, "Didn't think I'd ever agree with you, but you were correct. Data over drama." She smiled faintly and locked the screen. Across town, Nancy Pelosi was in a private strategy session. Her staff argued how to get ahead of the story again. They talked about new messaging vectors, revised talking points, and future interviews. But they all knew the reality. And regardless of what they did say after that, folks had already witnessed what had occurred, and they were not going to let them forget it. Karoline Leavitt didn't simply silence Pelosi. She re-established the tone of the discussion, and perhaps, just perhaps, altered expectations for what political truth-telling was meant to